Good afternoon, everybody. This is Brian Arori speaking from OSSI. I'm the Senior Advisor for Budget and Finance. Today, we're going to be talking about the LEA Financial Reporting Application. Before I jump into the presentation, just a few housekeeping things for everyone that's on the webinar. First, this is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the OSSI website. Number two, if you have any questions during the presentation, you can type them into the chat. Just make sure that your question is being sent to everyone so that everyone else can see your question. I will try my best to pay attention to the chat as I go through the presentation and answer your question as it's being asked. But if I don't get to it right away, I apologize in advance. If you want to speak, everyone is muted upon entry into this meeting. I do not think that you all have the ability to unmute yourselves. I could be wrong about that, but if you do want to ask a question, there is a raise your hand feature. And if I see that your hand is risen, I can unmute you and you can ask your question. The slides that are going to be displayed will also be made available online. So with that, I am going to jump in. So the LEA Financial Reporting Application, this is the second year that OSSI is collecting financial data from LEAs. So a lot of the stuff that you're going to see in this presentation is not new information. There are some small updates that we made to the application, which I'll go through. But to go through the agenda, we'll just do a quick overview of what the financial data collection is. I'll tell you what the updates are that were made to the application and to the guidelines for this year. I will quickly go through the per pupil expenditure reporting requirement and the maintenance of effort reporting requirement. Again, these are things that have largely remained unchanged from last year, but since there might be folks on this webinar and folks that are going to view the webinar after that have not done this before, I do want to talk a little bit about what the financial reporting application is actually going to do and how OSSI will use this information. Then I'm going to open up the application on the QuickBase website and just run through a quick demonstration. Then we'll talk about next steps, additional resources, and I'll open the floor to Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, you can ask them throughout the presentation, and I'll try to get to them. So first, the financial data collection overview. What is this? The financial data collection, this is an annual data collection process in which LEAs are submitting financial data to OSSI to meet two requirements. The first one is per pupil expenditures, and the second one is maintenance of effort. This is a federal reporting requirement as a result of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was passed in 2015. All LEAs are required to submit their financial data to OSSI. The timeline for this year, so the application opened up to LEAs on January 29th, and LEAs will have until March 22nd to submit their data to OSSI. As I said, this is an annual data collection, and LEAs will only need to submit information for this data collection process once per year, always around this time, the late winter, early spring. And the last bullet point is that financial data will be submitted via a data input into the LEA financial reporting application, which again, I'll do a full walkthrough of the application later in this presentation. So really quickly, there's three main updates that happened this year. The first one deals with maintenance of effort, which I'll go into more detail later in the presentation. But essentially, last year, LEAs needed to report their maintenance of effort expenditure information for the previous fiscal year. This year, because you all submitted your financial information to us last year, we can automatically calculate your maintenance of effort information from FY19, and we will compare that to the FY20 data that you are submitting this year. So this calculation will happen automatically in the financial reporting application. Number 2, per pupil expenditures. So we made a really simple change in the application that so the application will now display all of the information that will be displayed on the school report card. Last year, we displayed some of the information. This year, all of the information that will be on the report card will also be displayed in the application. And that will just make it easier for you all to see the full set of data that will be reported on the school report card. And then the last point here is there is a small clarification that we want to make about the excluded expenditures category. One of the components of the excluded expenditures is supplemental expenses made as a result of a presidentially declared disaster. So as you all know, COVID was a presidentially declared disaster. So when we get to the excluded expenditures section of this presentation, I just want to make a clarification for you all as you are calculating your excluded expenditures. So now I'm going to talk about the per pupil expenditures reporting. So financial data collected from LEAs will be used to report per pupil expenditure data for each school and each LEA. This is a federal requirement, so every state education agency, every district, LEA, and school in the country needs to meet this requirement. And the reason that this law was passed is so that this per pupil expenditure data would be made available to the public so that families, school leaders, policymakers, basically anybody can look at this expenditure data. And it's an opportunity to compare school expenditures with other publicly available data points for all public schools in the district. The data that OSSI collects and reports on the report card will not be used by OSSI in any statewide accountability. And the data will be reported on the DC school report card website. So this is what is actually written in the law. I'm not going to read it out, but basically by submitting your data to OSSI and OSSI reporting it on the school report card website, we are meeting the federal requirements. And the picture that you see below is just a screenshot that I took from the school report card website. This is on the profile page for each school and each LEA. And it just shows what the per pupil expenditure reporting looks like on that profile page, where it compares the school's per pupil expenditures to the LEA and to the DC average. And then users will be able to click on the link to get more detailed information. And all of this stuff that you all reported last year is on the DC school report card website right now. So if you've ever navigated to that website and looked at the financial data, you'll see that for every school in the district, there is this per pupil expenditure data, and you can click through and get more detail about every single school in the district. Just really quickly, some guidelines. So the per pupil expenditures are broken out into 2 categories, federal and then state and local. Expenditures will be reported based on the LEA's audited fiscal year data. When we ask you to submit your expenditures to us, we are asking you to submit your actual expenditures. You are not supposed to be submitting budgeted expenditures or average expenditures. Expenditures do not need to be broken out between personnel and non-personnel. If you actually read what the law says, it talks about personnel and non-personnel. Basically, what the law is asking for is that you're reporting your actual personnel data, actual non-personnel data in your submission. We calculate per pupil expenditures by dividing the school's expenditures by the enrollment audit student count, so the count as of the October 5th count date. And this is the second year of per pupil expenditure reporting. And the data that you will be submitting to OSSI over the next few weeks will be the data from the 1920 school year. So there's certain expenditures that we are not including in the per pupil expenditure calculation, and these are called excluded expenditures. And generally what the per pupil expenditure reporting is supposed to show is what are the expenditures for the day-to-day operations of a school. So there are certain expenditures that an LEA or a school may have over the course of the year that might throw that per pupil calculation like way out of whack if they were included. So for example, if a school did a $30 million construction project, we do not want that to be included in the per pupil expenditure calculation. So that $30 million construction project would be considered an excluded expenditure. So what that means is it would be we would aggregate all of your LEA and your school's excluded expenditures and report that as an aggregate. So things like debt service, capital expenditures, construction, all of those things will not be included. And the one thing that I want to call out here is the supplemental expenses made as a result of a presidentially declared disaster. So the clarification that we want to make here is that this is for non-education expenses only. So COVID-19 related expenditures for free public education should not be considered an excluded expenditure. So we all know that schools and LEAs have been receiving funding as a result of COVID, whether that's federal or local dollars. And these dollars are for the most part being spent on education expenses. And we want to make sure that those education expenses are captured when you are reporting your expenditures to OSSI. An example of something that would be like a non-education expense that is a result of COVID-19 would be if your school received funding to be set up as like a vaccination site for the city. That's not an education expenditure, so that would be considered an excluded expenditure. But if you're using if you're spending money on HVAC or additional technology, things like that are considered expenditures that are for education purposes. So those things would be included, and those would be included in your per pupil expenditure calculation and should not be part of the excluded expenditures. The last bullet point here is any expenditures that are sourced from private funds are also considered to be excluded. So all of this stuff is the same as last year with that additional clarification about the supplemental expenses made as a result of a presidentially declared disaster. I'm going to pause. There's one question in the chat. Where can we find this presentation and slide deck? These will be available on the OSSI website. There is a grants and funding section on the OSSI website where all of the guidelines, a link to the application, all of that stuff can be found. And I'll share that with you all at the end of the presentation. We also got another question. What if it is a capital expenditure due to COVID? So yes, if it is a capital expenditure, that would be considered an excluded expenditure because it is a capital expenditure. So if you, in the example that I gave where I said upgrades to HVAC, if you're capitalizing that expenditure, then it would be an excluded expenditure. But if you're purchasing books or hiring additional staff or anything like that, those would not be considered excluded expenditures. And if you have any questions about this, as you're going through your accounting books for the 1920 school year. You can definitely ask me and let me know, and I'll be happy to get you answers. Another question, so IT laptops for students would be excluded since it is a capital expense. If you're capitalizing your IT purchases, then yes, that would be an excluded expenditure. These are great questions, so thank you for raising them. I don't see any more questions coming in, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. This is just basically how the per pupil expenditure calculation is made. So what an LEA would submit is their federal expenditures and their state and local expenditures, those two top blue boxes. And we would divide those two amounts by the number of students. And in this example, 700 students would get us to the per pupil expenditures from federal sources and state and local sources. And then LEAs would also be submitting their excluded expenditures. I see one more question. So to clarify, so what we include or not depends on each school's own unique capitalization policy within their own financial policies. Yes, yes. The answer to that is yes. So just to go back, this is an example for a single site LEA where all of the expenditures are happening at the school site. For all of you LEAs that have multiple schools, we want to make sure that all applicable expenditures are included in the school per pupil expenditure calculation. LEAs that have multiple schools and or a central office, you may have expenditures that do not apply directly to the school level, or these expenditures may apply to multiple schools. These are what we refer to as centralized expenditures. So an example of this is salaries of central office staff. So OSSI believes that LEAs are the most knowledgeable about their school level and their centralized level expenditures. So we are leaving it up to the LEA's discretion as to how centralized expenditures are allocated to the school level. So LEAs must show the amount of centralized expenditures that are allocated to each school. And LEAs must also provide their methodology for applying centralized expenditures to each school. So basically, if your school has like a central office function, it is up to you, to your LEA, to decide how those expenditures that happen within that central office are allocated to each school in your LEA. And just to give you a few examples on the next slide, these are some of the methodologies that your LEA could potentially use. So the first one is a per pupil basis. So for centralized services that benefit all students across all schools, these expenses can be allocated to schools on a per pupil basis. So for example, if you have a salary for the executive office, that could be allocated across all students in the school system. And then there's a few more. You could do per staff. You could do a selected per pupil basis. You could do it however you want, with the caveat being that there is a centralized expenditure methodology narrative portion of this reporting requirement that all LEAs will need to submit to OSSI. And I'll go through that when I open up the application and show you. So this is an example of what a multi-site LEA would look like. So they have their school level expenditures that are broken out by federal and state and local. And then they also have their school share of centralized expenditures that are also broken out between federal and state and local. And the excluded expenditures are reported as an LEA amount. And if you total up all those expenditures, you would get the total LEA expenditures. And just to show an example of what the per pupil amounts would look like for a multi-site LEA, in the first column, it would show what the per pupil expenditures are for the school. And you can see that it's broken out between school level and school share of centralized expenditures. And you would also be able to see what the LEA's total per pupil expenditures are at the school level and at the school share of centralized expenditures. And I do realize I'm kind of going through this pretty quickly because all of this is not necessarily new. Most LEAs have already done all of this reporting last year, and we're keeping it the same. So it should be no surprises for you all as you're going through. So here's the timeline for submission. As I said, the application is already open. It opened on January 29th. We've already had a few LEAs submit, so that's pretty awesome. But you do have until March 22nd to submit your financial information to OSSI. After the deadline, which is March 22nd, I will be reviewing all of the submissions just to make sure that they look correct. So I may come back to you if I notice something looks a little off, and I would, ask for clarification or ask you to correct it. And then we will work with our report card vendor to get all of the financial data published on the report card in May. And that is all for the per pupil expenditures. So I'm going to jump into the maintenance of effort portion of this, but definitely ask questions if you want, and I can just pause and go back to the per pupil expenditure stuff. So maintenance of effort. So financial data collected by OSSI through this reporting will also be used to ensure that charter LEAs are meeting MOE requirements. So MOE is a relatively new thing for the DC charter LEAs. I know DCPS has had to meet this requirement for a while, but as a result of ESSA, DC charters are now required to meet the maintenance of effort requirement. So basically, MOE requires that subgrantees that receive federal funds maintain a minimum floor of state and local funding for education from year to year. So we did this test last year for each LEA, and I believe that every LEA met the maintenance of effort requirement. There's no changes to how we're doing this calculation for this year, so it'll be the same thing. Basically, what MOE does is it looks at your state and local expenditures from the previous fiscal year and compares that to your state local expenditures for the next fiscal year. And what it does is the test is to make sure that each LEA is spending from the state and local funding source at least 90% as the previous fiscal year. So it's kind of confusing. I do have a little table that will sort of help break this down. But before I get to that, I do have a list on this slide of the federally covered programs. So for LEAs that are receiving any of the federal funding programs that are listed on this slide, MOE applies to you. If you do not receive any of these federal funds, then MOE does not apply for your LEA. So these are things like Title 1A, Title 1D, Title 2A, Title 3, Title 4A, Title 4B. Those are all of the federally covered programs. So as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, we did a minor update to our application this year. So we are pulling the data that each LEA submitted last year and loading that into the application so that it will automatically compare FY19 data to the new FY20 data that you will be submitting. And OSSI will review the MOE expenditure reports before providing LEAs their preliminary allocations for next year's ESEA funds, which will happen in summer 2021. I'm going to pause because I see that we have a question from Kim. Kieran mentioned there might be new guidance for SPED MOE this year given COVID. Do you know if there have been any changes or on the requirements this year? Great question. We have not received any guidance from the U.S. Department of Education about MOE requirements for this part of MOE yet. I do have some points that I want to make in a second about what happens if you don't meet MOE, but let me get there first. But I'm going to just jump back because I did get reminded that I missed one point. So this maintenance of effort that I'm talking about right now is as a result of ESEA and ESSA. This is not the MOE requirement that deals with IDEA funds. Those requirements, as it says in this presentation, remain the same and are handled separately through your IDEA grants manager. But it does sound like maybe the IDEA MOE stuff is changing. So just continue to look out for guidance from Aussie and from Kieran Bowen about the SPED MOE stuff, because that could potentially change. So thanks, Kim, for raising that. So if a subgrantee fails to meet the maintenance of effort requirement, and also failed to meet MOE once before within the 5 immediately preceding fiscal years, OSSI must reduce the federal funding allocation in the exact proportion by which the LEA failed to maintain the effort. So basically what this means is if an LEA fails to meet MOE in this round of reporting, nothing happens to your federal funding allocations. But if the LEA does fail to meet the MOE requirement again over the next 5 years, then there would be a reduction to the federal funding that you receive. So as I said, no LEAs failed MOE last year. So if an LEA did fail MOE this year, that would be like the first time that you failed. So you would need to fail again over the next 5 years in order to trigger that reduction in your federal funding. I'm gonna just skim over the rest of the bullet points here, except for the bottom one, which is the important point that I had wanted to mention. So there is a federal waiver process. So the U.S. Department of Education may waive this requirement only in cases of exceptional or uncontrollable circumstances, such as a natural disaster, change in the organizational structure of the agency, or a precipitous decline in the agency's fiscal resources. So it is entirely possible that the U.S. Department of Education could issue waivers because of COVID. We just have not officially received any word from the U.S. Department of Education yet about any of that. So again, this waiver process would only apply if you failed to meet MOE. And if you did fail MOE, there is a waiver process that OSSI can go through with the U.S. Department of Education to see if the LEA can get a waiver. So as you're going through the MOE reporting, and if it does happen that you have failed to meet MOE for the previous year, whether it's due to COVID or and any changes to spending that happened over the 1920 school year, then OSSI will work with you and the Department of Education to see if we can get a waiver. So as we're calculating the FY20 MOE expenditures, basically what we're doing is we're adding up all of the state and local expenditures at the school level and at the school share of centralized expenditures to get that total number that is your state and local expenditures. And we'll compare that to your FY19 expenditures that are already in the application. You'll see that the LEA's excluded expenditures, whether or not those are federal or state and local, like those excluded expenditures are not included in the MOE calculation. So here's just the example, and this is the same example that we shared last year. So if in FY19 your LEA had a total of $1 million in state and local expenditures, that would mean that in order to pass MOE, your LEA would need to have spent at least $900,000 of state and local expenditures in order to meet in order to meet the MOE requirement. So if, for example, if you're looking at the third row here, your actual LEA spending was $850,000, that would trigger a failure to meet MOE because you needed to spend $900,000. You only spent $850,000. So there's that $50,000 deficit or variance, which resembles a 5.6% reduction. So if this was the second year that you had failed MOE, then OSSI would have to reduce your federal funding allocation by that 5.6%. The column on the right, which is the amount per student, is we give you 2 opportunities to pass MOE. So there's that first one, which is your aggregate expenditures. The second one is we look at this on a per student basis because it is entirely possible that an LEA has a much lower enrollment count from one year to the next, which would presumably mean that there's a lot less spending on a per pupil basis. So we look at it both ways. So as long as your LEA passes either one of these tests, the aggregate expenditure test or the per pupil test, then you're in the clear and you have met the MOE requirement. Any questions? I am going to quickly jump over to my web browser and open up the application. Just give me 1 second to share here. Okay. Just give me 1 second. I'm just moving some windows around so I can see your chats. And so when you log into the financial reporting application, this is the screen that you'll see. And if I could just get confirmation that you all can see this, see my web browser, that would be awesome. So this is the home page. Okay, great. Thank you. So you can see it. This is the home page that you'll see when you log into the financial reporting application. And this should look familiar to you if you did this last year. There's a menu of buttons in the top left-hand corner of the application. And then there's also an overview, some navigation and instructions, and some background. I do want to call out that there is a link right here on the front page that has step-by-step instructions for how to complete this. So if you're ever lost, it's a great document to open up and just guide you through this process. So what an LEA would do when they log in is they would click on this button that says LEA Expenditure Data. And this will pull up your LEA, and you would click on your LEA name. In this case, this is OSSI Academy. And then you'll see this is the page where we would collect the financial data from your LEA. So in this case, you'll see that the LEA's name is OSSI Academy. This is the LEA code. This is where you would put your LEA excluded expenditures for FY20. And then this box is where you'll see your state and local expenditures for maintenance of effort from FY19. So this is where we've pulled the data that you submitted last year, and we populate it in this box for you to see. And then you'll see in the school level expenditures section, this is where you're going to enter in your expenditures for each of your schools. So if you're a single site LEA, you'll just see one school here. In this case, OSSI Academy has 3 different schools. So what we're going to do is we're going to quickly fill in the information that you'll need to provide to OSSI. So in order to do that, you click on the edit button in the right-hand corner. And there's 5 boxes that need to get filled in. So the first one is you would put your total LEA excluded expenditures in this box. So I'm just going to say $20 million is what the excluded expenditures were for this LEA because they did a construction project and spent $20 million on that. So that's the excluded expenditures. And then these 4 columns are the 4 pieces of information that we will need from each LEA, or for each school in the LEA. So all you have to do is click on the box and fill in some information. So in this column is the total school level expenditures from federal sources. So that's $250,000. And then total school level expenditures from state and local. And let's say that that's 3.5 million. And then if you are a multi-site LEA and you need to divvy up your centralized expenditures to the school level, you would do that in these 2 columns. The first one is for federal sources and the second one is for state and local. So let's just say, again, like $250,000 for federal and $1 million here. So you'll see as you're entering in this information, all of the rest of the fields on this screen are populating. So the total expenditures at this school were $5 million. Here's the enrollment count. And here's the per pupil expenditures broken out on that per pupil basis. So state and local, federal, total, and then there's like just other ways of reporting this information. You'll see like percentages and stuff like that. All of these boxes are things that will appear on the school report card website. So I'm really quickly just gonna jump through and just type in some numbers for the other LEA, for the other schools that are in the LEA. And go from here. So you'll see that all of these things are populating. I'm just gonna, this one, I added an extra 0, so it kind of looks a little off. So that looks better. So you'll see that this bottom part, the LEA level expenditures, that hasn't updated yet. What you would need to do is save and close. And I did see another question. Is there a concern that because of COVID, many schools are spending less money this year on non-capitalized expenses, and that furthermore, schools are receiving additional federal funds from SOAR, CARES, PPP, and so that for many, many schools, MOE will be significantly lower than last year? Don't apologize for asking all the questions. These are all important questions. Yes, we have heard from some LEAs that they are worried that they haven't spent enough of their state and local dollars to meet the MOE requirement from comparing FY19 to FY20. I do understand that. You do need to report the expenditures and the source of expenditures as it actually happened for FY20. So as I said before, we have not specifically received any guidance from the US Department of Education on this yet. So if we do receive any guidance that would allow for waivers, then we will certainly do that for LEAs that do not meet the MOE requirement. There's also the fact that this would have to be triggered 2 times over the next 5 years, but I do understand that we could potentially run into the same issue the next go around because there is more federal money coming. The purpose of the MOE expenditure, the maintenance of effort calculation, is to make sure that LEAs are spending roughly the same amount of state and local expenditures as the previous year. So if your local expenditures are down, then you would fail for this year. But we will work with Ed and we will work with you if we need to request waivers. As I said before, natural disaster is one of the reasons that Ed could grant a waiver. So if Ed will consider COVID to be a natural disaster, I'm not saying that they will, but it sounds likely that they could, then maybe there will be like a blanket waiver for all LEAs for this year. But as of this point, we have not received that guidance yet. So we're just going to proceed with the reporting as we have done from the previous year and go forward from there. So I hope I answered your question, but we do understand the concerns that LEAs have because they have received additional federal funds this year, and which would potentially lower their local expenditures for FY20. So jumping back to the application, so I had clicked save. So you'll see that all of the information that I typed in is now populated. You'll also see that the LEA level expenditures table has also populated with all of the information. So basically, this is all the information that's going to be reported on the school report card website. So you can review it all here to make sure it looks accurate. And the next thing that you'll need to do is submit your centralized expenditure methodology. So you would do that right here where you click Add LEA Document. But before I do that, I'm just going to jump back and click the Home button and show you that you can download the centralized methodology template by clicking this button right here. And you can also upload that completed document by clicking the button here. So you can do it from the LEA Expenditure Data tab. You can do that here, add the LEA document, and then it'll bring you to a page where your LEA is populated. You would hit the drop down and do centralized methodology expenditure. You would hit browse to find your file and upload it, and then you'd hit save and close. Every LEA needs to upload this document in order to submit their data, even if you are not a multi-site LEA, and even if you do not have any centralized expenditures that need to be allocated to the school level, you'll still need to download the document, fill it out. You'll see that there's just like a checkbox that says you do not have any centralized expenditures. So you would just check that box off and then submit that form. I'm going to cancel out of this page, which will take me back to this expenditure summary page. So again, once you upload a document, you'll see that it's been uploaded here. And I'm going to bring you back to the home page. So after you type in your data, you save it. The next thing that you want to do is go to Certify and Submit. And on the Certify and Submit page, you'll see your LEA listed here, and you'll click Certify and Submit. And then again, we just show all of the information here that you've entered, and as it will appear on the report card. You'll also see the maintenance of effort summary, and the maintenance of effort summary will tell you there's a green box if you've met MOE. So in this case, the LEA did meet MOE. If it's red, it will say you did not meet MOE. And then these are just the two MOE tests that I had talked about earlier. So this is the MOE aggregate expenditure test, and the one right below it is the per pupil expenditure test. So you'll be able to see which of the tests you passed, which of the tests you failed. If you scroll over to the right, the last column will say met MOE. So in this case, the LEA met both tests. And again, as long as the LEA meets one of these tests, then the LEA has met the MOE requirement for this year, and you are golden. You're good to go for this year. So at the bottom of the Certify and Submit page, there's a checkbox here that says the centralized expenditure methodology has been submitted. So again, I did not submit it, so this box is not checked. But when you do submit that document, this box will automatically be checked. And then you need to check this box that says, I certify the data in the financial reporting QuickBase application are accurate. By selecting the checkbox, I understand the data will become final and displayed on the report card website. The data on this application will become read-only and cannot be further edited. So once you check this box and hit save and close, it will lock this application. You cannot edit this data further. So please just make sure that all of your data is correct before you certify that it is correct and submit and hit save and close. So once you hit save and close, you are done. And we will take that data, we will look at it, review it to make sure it looks correct, and then it will be published on the report card in May. I am going to stop sharing my browser. And I am going to open up the PowerPoint again. So we've done the application. So next steps. So as I said, LEAs will complete financial expenditure reporting by March 22nd. OSSI will share updates and reminders leading up to the deadline. The school report card website will be updated to include financial expenditure data in May. And resources will be made available to the public in May 2021 so that they have a full understanding of the per pupil expenditure data. So as a reminder, when we publicized this information last year, we made some brochure documents and things available to the public so that they have a better sense of what they're looking at. The documents that we submit this year and share with the public will be similar. We'll probably just update them for the dates and for any new information that we think the public will want to know about the per pupil expenditure reporting. These are additional resources. So there's a link to the application. There is a link to the guidelines for the per pupil expenditure reporting. There is a link to the maintenance of effort memo that OSSI had shared with you last year, a link to the report card website, a link to the school report card technical guide, which will explain how the calculations are done, and the OSSI grants and funding resources. So this is the page that has all of these links to the application, to the step-by-step instructions, to the presentation, to the recording of this presentation. All of that stuff will be available on the grants and funding page. With that, I will open it up to Q&A. If you have any questions that you want to email me, my email is here, ryan.arori@dc.gov. And I will be happy to answer them for you. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn on my camera and see if anybody has any questions. And again, you can type them in the chat, or you can try the raise your hand feature and I can unmute. So we have a question from Nate. The SPED MOE came up and it sounds like we should wait for further guidance and information there. What about excess cost reporting? Has information and a deadline been shared? I am not familiar with anything about the excess cost reporting. I will ask Kieran about that. I think he's the one that deals with the excess cost reporting. And I will try to get some information from him or ask him if he can send out something to LEAs regarding excess cost reporting. You're welcome, Nate. Are there any other questions? I also don't think anybody has raised their hand. Going through my list here. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. I will stick around for a few more minutes in case anybody does have any questions. Again, I shared my email address. If you have any questions as we're leading up to March 22nd, I will send this presentation. I will send this recording out so that everyone can see it. I will also send out reminders as we approach March 22nd Last year, everybody obviously hit the deadline, so thank you so much for doing that. I know we will all be able to do that again. And with that, I thank everyone for attending. And again, I'll stick around if there's any more questions. So thanks everyone for attending, and we will all talk soon.